Hello everyone and welcome to the first discussion on exam 3. We are beginning a journey through the nervous system, and this journey is going to be the only exam of the semester where our focus will be on one body system, the nervous system. For this, take a look at your syllabus, but we are going to be taking a look at portions of chapter 12, the nervous system and nerve tissue. We're then going to go looking at the anatomy of the nervous system. We'll be looking specifically at the anatomy of the brain, of the spinal cord. We'll be taking a look at neurons. We'll be taking a look also at naming some nerves of the body. We'll spend quite a bit of time looking at the spinal cord and many of the spinal nerves. And we'll also be talking about the cranial nerves that come off from the brain. We'll also be talking about the autonomic nervous system. We'll be talking about reflexes. We'll also be discussing special senses and a little bit from chapter 16 on the neurological exam. So all of this information will be on one exam, and that is exam 3. So let's get started in 12.1 in the Blossom, and we are specifically looking at the basic structure and function of the nervous system. Note, we are only going to be discussing 12.1, 12.2, and 12.3. You will not be discussing this semester action potentials or the communication between neurons. Those are topics that you will dive into deeply in physiology. So, basic structure and function of the nervous system. We can divide the nervous system up a couple different ways. One is a straight up anatomical division, a structural division, and that is we can say that we have the brain and the spinal cord, and you know their locations. You know that the brain is in the cranial cavity, protected by the cranial bones, and you know that the spinal cord is extending down from the brain through the vertebral foramina of the vertebra. So we'll be discussing this quite a bit, and we'll be looking specifically at many of the parts of the brain and of the spinal cord. So we can divide it up into a couple different ways. One is discussing the central nervous system, the CNS, versus the peripheral nervous system, the PNS. So the CNS or the PNS. Very simple. When we talk about the central nervous system is composed of just the brain and the spinal cord. Just the brain and the spinal cord. And then everything outside of the brain, everything outside of the spinal cord, out in the periphery, is referred to as the peripheral nervous system, the PNS. So that's really simple, right? We have the CNS and the PNS, and it describes to you here the location, like I just mentioned. Looking at this diagram, we can see that the brain and the spinal cord, just the spinal cord, is part of the CNS. Everything that pops out of the spinal cord and travels out into the body is going to be part of the peripheral nervous system. Nerves are part of those structures that come off from both the spinal cord and from the brain, and I will be discussing later on, not today, but we'll be learning about the cranial nerves that come off from the cranium, and we'll also be talking about the spinal nerves that come off from the spinal cord. Note that nerves are only found in the PNS. We'll talk about this later some more, but there are no nerves inside your spinal cord, and there are no nerves inside your brain. I'll describe to you what is inside the brain and the spinal cord as we progress through this unit. Another thing I'm going to point out to you now, it's not going to make any sense to you right now, but I want to point it out to you because you'll be coming back and looking at this diagram later, and that is also in the peripheral nervous system, there are ganglia. Ganglia are clusters of cell bodies, and as you look at this image, you barely can even see that the point is going to this little cluster that you can see right here. And there are clusters of cell bodies that are up and down just outside of the spinal cord. So that's a ganglion. Again, we'll come back to that. But I want to point out that ganglia and nerves are only found in the peripheral nervous system. Okay, so that's one way to describe the nervous system, central nervous system versus peripheral nervous system. I'll go on and describe a different way in a moment. I'll say it now, I'll describe it in a few minutes, and that is we can also talk about the functional ways of dividing up the nervous system. That is, there are the sensory components of the nervous system, and there are the motor components of the nervous system. So how information comes in and how information leaves the nervous system. That's also going to be another way of dividing up and looking at the nervous system. So this chapter, a lot of it is looking at nervous tissue. Recall that nervous tissue is our fourth type of tissue, right? We've been spending a lot of time discussing epithelial tissues and connective tissues. And in the last unit, we talked about muscle tissues. Now we're at nervous tissue. So we'll be looking at nervous tissue. There is nervous tissue found in both the CNS and the PNS. And in nervous tissue, there are basically two types of cells. There are neurons, and we're going to learn quite a bit about neurons. These are the cells that send electrical signals throughout your nervous system. And then there are additional cells called glial cells. And you may recall from our vocabulary, or what's coming up in the vocabulary, that glia refers to the term for glue. So the glial cells hold together, glue together the nervous system. So the glial cells, also called the neuroglial cells, exist also in nerve tissue. We're going to spend most of our time looking at the neuron, but I will be describing to you a few different glial cells as well. So in pre-lab 6 and throughout this unit, you are going to get to know the neuron very, very well. Neurons come in different shapes and sizes, as we'll see, but there are a number of things that are common to neurons. And let's take a look at those things. The words are up here, and here is the image. So a couple things that are common in all neurons. There is a cell body. As you're seeing this cell, be reminded this does not look at all like the spherical cell that we labeled back in the second or third chapter, right? When we looked at cells, we always had that spherical cell. It had the nucleus in the center and the Golgi and the lysosomes. We'll see a lot of those same organelles, but clearly the shape of the cell is very, very different. Now the cell body is basically what I'm circling here. The other name for the cell body is the soma. So you'll see this term up here, soma or cell body. Soma or cell body. Now coming off from the soma are a number of projections. Just like in bone, where something that's stuck out of a bone was oftentimes called a process, same is true here. These are processes that are sticking out of the soma. Now the vast majority of these processes are dendrites. Dendrites are the shorter type of process, and we'll see as we go through this, the dendrites are the way by which the signal leaves the neuron. Then most neurons have one much longer single process referred to as the axon. And we'll see that that is the way by which signals leave. And I think I may have just misspoke for a second. Dendrites are receiving information, okay? Receiving information. And the axon is sending it out away from the cell body. Yeah, I think I did misspeak there for a second. So we'll look at these pieces and parts of the neuron We'll learn more about neurons as we go. And we're going to see that neurons come in many different shapes and sizes as well. Just a reminder, make sure that for the sections that I do go through, that you are answering these questions. If it's a section that we skip over, you do not have to answer those questions. Another thing, and keep in mind, this chapter is very much an introduction. Much of what I'm describing now is going to be introduced, and then you'll be referring back to it as we go further into the nervous system, and much of this, well, all of this, will make a lot more sense as we get more perspective. When you look at nervous tissue, you will hear about white matter and gray matter. White matter and gray matter. And so we'll describe this as we go through this. Gray matter is parts of the brain, in this case, where there are more cell bodies and dendrites. So where there's gray matter, there are more cell bodies and dendrites. Where there is white matter, there are more axons. Okay, regions with many, many axons. So as we look at this slice through the brain, okay, you can see that it's labeling white matter, and there's a video for you to watch here as well. But there's white matter, and it is lighter in color, and this would be primarily axons. And then around the outside edge of the brain, what's called the cortex, around the outside of the brain, you see this darker color. That is gray matter. And it really does have sort of an elephant gray color to it in actual brain tissue. I'll show you a picture of that in a few minutes. And gray matter is where in the brain you have a higher percentage of cell bodies and of dendrites. Now, what is it that makes the white matter white? Right? What makes white matter white is a protein that is lipid rich. It's got a lot of fat in it. A lipid rich protein called myelin. Myelin, we're going to see, is what gives white matter its white color. And really, gray matter is simply the lack of myelin. Okay, so you can think of it a couple different ways. That white matter is there because of myelin. Myelin, as we'll see, is only associated with axons. You will only see myelin around axons. So let's think about what I just said, right? White matter is where you have axons, right? White matter is where there is myelin. Gray matter is where there are cell bodies and dendrites. And as we'll see in a moment, myelin is never associated with cell bodies or dendrites. Here's an actual brain, and you can see, we're not making this up, if you cut into a fresh brain, you will see that there is white matter, right? Very clear, very white, versus the outer layer, which does indeed have a gray color to it. Again, I'm describing a number of ideas that we'll continue to discuss over and over and over. Earlier, as we began this discussion, I said that in the PNS that there are ganglia, or many, ganglion is singular, and many ganglia, and that told you briefly that a ganglion was in the PNS, it was a cluster of cell bodies. So there's the definition, right? There's the definition of a ganglion. Turns out that when we're discussing the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system, that there are going to be different names for similar components within these two divisions. So the same thing found in the CNS is called a nucleus. So a nucleus is a collection of neuron cell bodies in the CNS. Now this word causes confusion because up until now, what has a nucleus been? Right? Up until now, a nucleus has been the center of the cell, typically. Inside the nucleus is where we earlier described where transcription happens, or it's where the chromosomes are found, right? When we were thinking about mitosis, we think about the chromosomes being located in the nucleus. If you've taken chemistry, you know that the nucleus is the center of the atom, and it's there that you find protons and neutrons. So this is a third and very different way of using that same word, nucleus. Nucleus is in the brain, is a group of cell bodies, again, found only in the CNS, which would be the brain or the spinal cord. So be watching for this terminology. And this confusion is described here for you and is drawn out here for you. Again, a nucleus in an atom, a nucleus in a cell. But what we're referring to now is a group of cell bodies in the brain. And take a look at this picture. Let me blow it up a little bit. Right? This is circling an area of gray matter. Remember, gray matter is going to be cell bodies. So wherever you see all this gray matter stuck inside the brain, that can also be referred to as a nucleus, a group of cell bodies. And cell bodies, I'll keep saying it, are gray in color. Another term that at first throws some students off is this term nerve versus tract. What is a nerve? I told you that a nerve was a structure found only in the PNS. So PNS, the PNS has nerves, whereas the CNS, there's a tract. Okay, remember I told you a moment ago there are no nerves inside the brain? Instead, we call it a tract. So what is a tract, or what is a nerve? It is a bundle of axons. Right, so a bundle of axons is a tract. A bundle of axons in the CNS is a tract. A bundle of axons traveling through the PNS is instead called a nerve. One more thing to keep track of is that axons are also referred to as fibers. Okay, as fibers. Now this also causes some problem, because up until now fibers have meant a couple different things. Recall back in our discussion of connective tissues, fibers were proteins, weren't they? They were collagen and elastin and reticular fibers, those fibers found out in the ground substance of connective tissues. And then when we got to muscle, fibers were the cells. Remember, a muscle cell is also called a muscle fiber. So there were two very different ways of using the term fiber, and now here we are in the nervous system, and the term fiber means something yet again. Here it refers to just axons. An axon is also called a nerve fiber. So let me just add that right here. An axon is also referred to as a nerve fiber. Okay, so that's an important thing to remember as you're reading questions or reading the text. When you see the word fiber in relationship to neurons, it's referring to the axon, right? A neuron is the nerve, or an axon is a nerve fiber. So let's make sense of this for us, shall we? So here is the eye. Here's the left eye. You're going to get a chance to dissect an eye in Lab 6. So the eye, coming off the back of the eye, is the optic nerve. Remember, the nerve is the structure outside of the brain. But as the nerve comes back underneath the brain, at some point that nerve is going to permeate up into the brain. And when the optic nerve goes inside the brain, that same set of tissue, that same structure, is now referred to as the optic tract. So an optic nerve is outside of the brain. The optic tract is the same material, simply we just changed names, and now we're referring to the optic tract. Okay, the optic tract. So this is a good way to remember or visualize what the difference is between nerve and a tract. It's really simply the location. The location. Okay, it's the same cell, same buildup, same material, simply a different location. I'll point out something here too while we're looking at this, and this will be a common theme that we'll see in the nervous system. Many, not all, but really most nerves cross over from one side of the brain to the other side of the brain. And we call this crossing over decussation. Now that word is not on this page, I don't believe, but let me go ahead and add it right here. Okay, so decussation. That is a term that just means crossing over. And what we see down here is that the nerve is crossing from the left side over to the right side. So that crossing over is called decussation. And in the case of the optic nerve, that is referred to as the optic chiasm. Now let's figure out where this word decussation comes from, and let's figure out where this word chi comes from. So when you hear the word decussation, I want you to think, and this is going to take me a second to get there, but it kind of sounds like decade, doesn't it? And a decade, you know, is equal to 10 years. And what is the Roman numeral for 10? The Roman numeral for 10 is an X. So that's what this decussation means. It's referring to the crossing over. Okay. Now, also in that, you may be familiar with the Greek letter chi. And the Greek letter chi also looks like an X. Okay, so when you see this word chiasm, it's referring to this crossing over, this X that is seen. When you hear the word decussation, same thing. Think decade. Think 10 years is an X in Roman numerals. It is the crossing over. Okay, so we'll come back and we'll talk a lot more about the eye, about these pathways that cross over. We'll be talking about different parts of the brain that are doing different things. But for now, we'll just move forward thinking about nerve versus tract. So everything I've just said is, of course, described to you in words as you read through this. And here are those perfect definitions, right? A group of cell bodies in the CNS is called a nucleus. A group of cell bodies in the PNS is called a ganglion. A bundle of axons. Remember, axons are going to be white because of that myelin that's wrapped around them. So a bundle of axons in the CNS is called a tract, whereas if you're out in the PNS, a bundle of axons is instead called a nerve. If you are looking at brain matter, if you need to look for damage or issues with the brain, the best imaging for that is an MRI. We described MRIs back in chapter 1. Recall that MRIs use very, very strong magnets, okay? And you can also use CT scans as well, but MRIs are the best way to look at soft tissue. Okay, so I've described to you the structural division of the nervous system. That is very simple. The brain and spinal cord are CNS, and everything outside of the brain or spinal cord is out in the periphery. It is the PNS, or the peripheral nervous system. Now, the other way of dividing up the nervous system is its functional divisions. Its functional divisions. And we'll see that the CNS and the PNS are both part of what I'm about to describe. What we're referring to here is that your nervous system is receiving sensory information. Your nervous system is responsible for perceiving your senses. So we have this portion of the nervous system that is receiving information. This is the sensory or the sensation portion of the nervous system. And then once the nervous system receives this sensation, it is then going to integrate that information, right? It's going to bring that information up into the spinal cord or up into the brain. It's going to integrate, process, think about the information, and then finally the brain is going to respond, and it's going to respond through what's referred to as motor function, right? So we have sensory, we have motor, so sensory functions, motor functions, and then that integration, how it's all brought together. So stimulus. What's a stimulus? A stimulus is something that turns on your senses, if you will. So we know this, guys. We know that if you eat, right, your taste buds are turned on. What's the stimulus? The chemicals, right? The chemicals that you eat. We'll talk more about that when we get to taste. You know that light, right, is perceived by the eye. That light is the stimulus. It turns on nerve endings in your eye, which then are sent to the brain and give you your sense of vision. But that also gives you your sense of color and your sense of movement, right, and shadows. Then there are things like touch, right? You feel something. That is a stimulus. That stimulus can be pleasant. It can be painful. That stimulus can be pressure, right? You can squeeze on your finger and you'll feel that pressure, or you can just lightly touch your finger and you are also aware of that light touch. So the stimulus is the movement or the touch of the skin. There are nerve endings in your skin which then go to the brain and perceive that stimulation. And then finally there's smell, right? Not only is there taste, but there's smell. So as you smell different chemicals, that is a stimulus that triggers your sensory neurons in your nose. And then in your ear, you have sensory cells that are able to respond to sound waves, right, that your brain perceives as hearing and volume of sound and noise and pleasant conversation and all of that. And then you also have in your inner ear your balance centers, your vestibular system, and we'll be talking about that later in the course as well. So we have all these abilities to stimulate our nervous system. Those are the stimuli, and they are traveling. Those stimuli are turning on your sensory neurons. Now, in response to that, once your nervous system has sensed what's going on, there is then going to be the processing, right? Your parts of your brain, parts of your spinal cord are going to process, integrate, figure out what in the world these sensations mean, and then in response to those sensations, the brain may or may not decide to respond. So when the nervous system produces a response, we describe that signal is traveling down a motor neuron, okay? It's going down a motor neuron. That motor neuron is going to leave the brain or leave the spinal cord, and in response to that motor signal, you are going to do one of three things. You're either going to contract a muscle, right? You're going to, let's say you're touching a hot stove. You are going to, in response to that stimulus of the heat, your brain's going to respond to that, and you are going to pull back away from the heat. You also could be, though, telling a gland to secrete, right? Telling a gland to secrete. So your responses can either be to muscle, telling the muscle to contract. That can be skeletal, cardiac, or smooth muscle. Or the response could be going to a gland in the body, telling it to secrete something. So we've got the responses, we have the sensations, and as I mentioned, what's in between those two is the integration. So the incoming sensory information is integrated, and the stimuli are compared. They are, looked at based upon previous experiences, things like that, and then the brain either consciously or unconsciously makes a decision to respond to that through sending signals through a motor neuron. So if we look at what this looks like, we're not going to make this really difficult, but this is what we're going to refer to as the somatic nervous system. The somatic nervous system is responsible for conscious perception and voluntary motor responses. Think about this. Your somatic nervous system, right now you are consciously perceiving my voice. You're hearing my voice. You're looking at the screen. So your eyes are receiving visual information. Your ears are receiving auditory information. And then you are processing that information. And then perhaps right now you are clicking on your mouse or you are writing something as I say this. So you have decided, you have voluntarily caused those responses to the stimuli. So this is all about voluntary control. That means, and you know, that your only muscles that are voluntary are your skeletal muscles. So the somatic nervous system is all about conscious perception, right? You're aware that it's happening, and the potential movement of your skeletal muscles. Now, the only time that your skeletal muscles move involuntarily is in reflexes. We'll talk more in depth about reflexes later in this unit, but reflexes are an automatic involuntary response to typically a painful stimulus. So this is like when you touch a stove, right? You put your finger out on a hot stove. Even before you are aware that your finger is sizzling, you have already pulled your finger back away from that heat. So reflexes, and you didn't think about it, right? You didn't have any control over that. So reflexes are when the central nervous system causes your skeletal muscles to move without you. Think about also maybe stubbing your toe, right? You're walking along, or you step on a tack, you step on a Lego, you step on something on the ground. You know what happens. Even before you were aware of the discomfort, voluntarily or consciously, before you were even aware of it, you had already moved your foot, lifted your foot away from that pain. So we'll talk about reflexes later on. There's also a part of your nervous system that's responsible for all of the, quote, automatic involuntary parts of your body. So this is referred to as the autonomic nervous system. This is the ANS. Haven't talked about that yet. The autonomic nervous system, you're gonna read autonomic, but in your head you're gonna be reading and kind of saying automatic, right? The automatic nervous system, the autonomic nervous system. This is the part of your nervous system that's responsible for involuntary control of the body. This is the part of the nervous system that is helping you maintain your homeostasis. So this is all about involuntary. You know that the two muscle types that are involuntary are smooth and cardiac, right? So smooth and cardiac muscle are involuntary, so they are controlled through this division of your brain, of your nervous system, the autonomic nervous system, and also your glandular tissue. You don't have any control, you don't have any voluntary control as to when, for example, you are going to sweat, or when you are going to secrete pancreatic juices, or when your stomach is going to make gastric acids. So those secretions from your glands of your stomach, of your pancreas, even of your sweat glands, you don't have control over that. So that is also part of the autonomic nervous system. So great videos here. Read through and watch these videos on the autonomic nervous system. Okay, this is all about sweating, all about your heart rate, your digestive system. That is controlled largely by your autonomic nervous system. Now, there's another part of the nervous system that is just honestly beginning to be understood. It's really a specialized component of the autonomic nervous system, and it is called the ENS, the enteric nervous system. you may recognize enteric, meaning gut, right? Sort of your intestines. This is basically a separate component of your nervous system that is controlling the smooth muscles and glandular secretions of your digestive system. It is a subdivision of your PNS and has nothing at all to do with your CNS. So what we're learning as we learn more about the nervous system is that your gut, right, has a lot of nerve endings in it. And those nerves are sort of independent of the rest of the nervous system, and they are responsible for your digestive function. You have nerves and ganglia, again, only in the PNS, and then you have the spinal cord and the brain as major organs within the CNS. There's a little box about a specialized kind of mRNA, which is really cool. Won't be testing you on that, but it's a really cool thing to read about. And that brings us to the end of 12.1. Let's head on over to 12.2. So in this section, we're going to be taking a look at the structures of neurons, learning about the different types of neurons. We'll also be taking a look at the glial cells of both the CNS and the PNS. So let's first take a look at a neuron. In this illustration, let's take a look at the basic parts. And the first thing I want you to notice is how a neuron is similar to all of the other cells we've described, or most of the cells. So here we have a nucleus, right? This nucleus is surrounded by a nuclear envelope, just like we're accustomed. Inside the nucleus, there would be a nucleolus, although that's not obvious in this particular drawing. Around the nucleus, we're going to have the endoplasmic reticulum, both rough and smooth, and there is also going to be a Golgi apparatus. Okay, so the same sort of things we're accustomed to see in a cell are found here also in the neuron. There are also mitochondria. Remember, mitochondria are making ATP, and there's a fair number of mitochondria in a neuron because this is a very energy-needy cell. In order to send the electrical signals that neurons do, they require energy. And you see other organelles like lysosomes, right? Lysosomes and peroxisomes. And then out here in the cytoplasm, you see so many ribosomes. There are a lot of ribosomes in a neuron, and the reason is ribosomes, recall, are making proteins, and neurons are making bucket loads, that's my own terminology, but bucket loads of proteins. And those proteins are the neurotransmitters, the chemical signals that help to send these electrical signals. As we look, so those are the things that are similar, right? It has basically the same organelles that you would see in other cells. The difference, again, are all of these processes that we see moving out or away from the soma. So here, the majority of these processes are dendrites. They're shorter, it's not really obvious here. And then there is one much longer process. Now again, it's not labeled here, but this one going down at around 4 o'clock, this is the axon. Now the reason I know that this is the axon, even though I don't see that word anywhere labeled here, is that there is myelin. So this is the myelin that is surrounding the axon. I'll talk about the significance, purpose of myelin in a few minutes, but notice that there is no myelin protecting any of the dendrites, and there is no myelin surrounding the soma. Remember that myelin is white in color, kind of yellowish, fatty, but it's white in color, and for that reason, this is what makes white matter white, and axons are what you find in white matter. Cell bodies and dendrites are non-myelinated, and they appear as gray tissue. A couple other terms. The cytoplasm the cytoplasm of a neuron. Right here it just says cytoplasm, but the cytoplasm is also referred to as the perikaryon. Perikaryon. And that, from the vocab, means peri, around, karyo, nucleus. So basically, everything around and outside of the nucleus is referred to as the perikaryon. Again, fancy word for the cytoplasm of the neuron. You also see packed all these ribosomes in here. And those ribosomes collectively are referred to as the chromatophilic substances. Okay, and they were also historically referred to as Nissl bodies. So here's the deal on that. Nissl was the scientist who first looked under the microscope, looked at a neuron, and said, man, I see all these little splotchy dots out in the cytoplasm. Now, they didn't know that these were ribosomes. And so he got credit for describing these splotchy dots out in the nucleus, or out in the cytoplasm. So they became known as Nissl bodies. Now we know that those Nissl bodies really are just densely packed ribosomes. There's also a move in anatomy to remove people's names from their discoveries. So rather than calling these clusters of ribosomes Nissl bodies, they're now referred to as chromatophilic substances. All that means things, right, substances that have an affinity for philic, chroma, color. And these ribosomes pick up color. They look like little dots when you look at them under the microscope. So let's take a look at a neuron, and you'll watch this video. It'll describe the parts and structures of the neuron. And what you'll see is that neurons have a polarity. That means that information flows through neurons in a predictable way. Information will come into the soma through the dendrites. So information flows through the neuron from the dendrites across or through the cell body and then away or down the axon. So that directionality of the information is referred to as polarity of the neuron. Let's take a look at a couple more features of a typical looking neuron. Again, what I'm seeing here, here's the cell body or the soma. I'm seeing that there's a cell membrane, right? And then out here, the cytoplasm, you would call the perikaryon. There are these dendrites, and there is one longer process referred to as an axon, and we see that the axon is surrounded and protected by cells. First time you've heard about these cells are called Schwann cells. Now, Schwann cells are the cells that make the myelin. Okay, so you see these little Schwann cells, their life is dedicated to wrapping around a portion of the axon, protecting it. And you see that each of these Schwann cells has its own little nucleus, right? So these cells are mitotic, they can be replaced, they divide, that sort of thing. At the far end of the axon, notice that the axon then branches. Those branches are called telodendria. Telo. We've seen telo before. Think telophase, the last phase of mitosis. So telo means end. Dend, you know from the vocab, means trees. So telodendria from the Greek just means branches, right? At the end, tree branches at the end of the axon. The telodendria are going to reach out, and there's going to be a place where they come in very, very close contact with dendrites of yet another neuron. And where let's blow this up, and where the telodendria comes to the end, there's what's called the synapse. The synapse. Now we know that vocabulary related to the word synapse. Let's talk about that for a moment. Let me go down to the word synapse here if I can find it in the text and just put this note here. So what does synapse mean? Right? Synapse, syn means together. You go to you've already seen, like, for example, the pubic symphysis. So sim, or I should say syn, they both, sim or syn, both mean together. Like the pubic symphysis where the two pubic bones come together. Or you go to the symphony to hear the phonies come together, right? The symphony, the symphony. Syn, again, means together. APS, recall from our vocab, APS is to fit or fasten. So basically what a synapse is, it's where two things fit or fasten together, right? Fit or fasten together. So that's what a synapse is. So when we come to at the end of the telodendria, there's a synapse. It's where two things fit or fasten together. And here there can be lots of these boxes. There are lots of synapses where these cells come into very, very, very close contact. Notice that the synapse here is going from an axon to a dendrite in the next neuron. Okay, so this is that unidirectional information flow, right? The fact that your neurons have polarity. There is a front and a back, or a side that we know information is flowing through. You're going to be learning a lot about the parts of the neuron. You'll be labeling it a lot in lab, and you'll see it in mastering. You'll see it in a number of places. A couple other things about the neuron. Again, myelin is a protective, insulating protein that travels down the length of the axon, okay, just along the axon. There is, if we look though, between these Schwann cells, there's a gap. That gap, right, you see the space, there's a space in between these Schwann cells. That space was named after a dude named Ranvier, a French guy. So these are called the node of Ranvier. You might just hear them referred to as the nodes. So the nodes are simply the lesser protected gaps between the Schwann cells. At the nodes, there's very little myelin, right? So there's a little bit of vulnerability here to the axon. Secondly, and this will be a conversation that you'll dive into more completely next semester, but I'll say it probably in a few minutes. When the electrical signal travels down the axon, it travels much more quickly when there is myelin present. So this myelin is going to not only protect the axon, but it's also going to allow the signal to propagate down the axon much more quickly. That propagation occurs because the electrical signal essentially jumps or skips from node to node to node to node. So again, the Schwann cells are both insulating, but the myelin and the gaps, the nodes of Ranvier, are also providing a faster way for the electrical signal to travel down the axon. Another unique term is this one, the initial segment. The initial segment is basically also this region called the Axon Hillock. So the Axon Hillock, let's take a look at this picture again, is right here. It's not labeled on this particular diagram, but you see this triangular region, right? This triangular region, this is referred to as the Axon Hillock. Axon Hillock, like a little hill sort of thing. And this is also referred to as the initial segment because when the electrical signal is sent from the cell body, it initiates here. Okay, so the initial segment or the axon hillock. The axon hillock is more the anatomical name for this. Functionally, it's also referred to as the initial segment. Within the axon, there is cytoplasm. The unique name for that cytoplasm that travels down the axon is the axoplasm, right? So this isn't hard, right? The axoplasm is sort of like the cytoplasm down the axon. Neurons come in a number of different shapes and sizes. Let's go through one way of describing neurons. Number one, the most common type of neuron in the body are multipolar neurons. Now, what this word means is a multipolar neuron is one that has many dendrites. So far, every drawing that we've seen of a neuron has been a multipolar neuron. Multiple neurons, one axon. One axon. Okay? Most common. There are also, however, bipolar neurons. As the name suggests, there is one dendrite and there is one axon, right? Bipolar. Bipolar. So we're not going to see these very much. They are more specialized. Bipolar neurons are found involved with hearing and in vision, but just describe them from a shape standpoint or a morphology standpoint. This is a bipolar neuron. Then there are unipolar neurons. Now, this term, unipolar, it's also oftentimes called pseudo-unipolar because, right, it's falsely false, right? Pseudo, P-S-E-U-D-O. And what we see here is here's the soma, and there's one process that comes out of the soma, uni, right? Uni, one process, one little tiny process that sticks out. And then it comes to a T in the road, and now it splits. The majority of this is going to be axon, and then some of it will be dendrite. You'll see that diagrammed later on. Unipolar neurons, we're going to see these again. Unipolar neurons are the type of neurons we're going to find in our sensory neurons. I'll help you with this in a moment. So multipolar are the most abundant, they're most numerous. Your motor neurons are motor polar, multipolar. So motor, multipolar, motor, multipolar. Unipolar are going to be the sensory neurons that we'll be discussing later in the course. Bipolar neurons, we're just describing them here. You're not going to see them again. And then there are what is referred to as anaxonic, got to say it right, anaxonic neurons. These, as the name suggests, are neurons without, right, A-N meaning without an axon. But as you read through this unit, you will learn that that word is really an oxymoron or a misnomer, and that there really are likely axons involved. It's just that when you look at this neuron, you can't see one that is longer. So it's difficult to say that this neuron has an axon, but it does. And one of these branches would act as its axon functionally. So again, we have many, many different kinds of shapes, multi, uni, bi, and axonic neurons. Describing here, let's just make sure that I say this and circle this. So unipolar, these are going to be for us, and again, these are oftentimes called pseudo-unipolar. And these for us this semester are going to be our sensory neurons. So where do I find that? To highlight. There we go. Unipolar cells or unipolar neurons are exclusively sensory neurons. Sensory neurons. Okay, so that'll be our thing to remember for now. Bipolar neurons, again, have two processes. We're going to see them, though, in the special senses, smell, specifically there's some, and there's also some in vision, in seeing. Not very common, not our focus at all. Multipolar neurons, again, very common, the most common of all neurons. And what we see is that these multipolars have multiple dendrites, two or more, right? Two or more dendrites, but usually many, many more. In fact, some scientists have described some motor neurons, some multipolar neurons, have up to 100,000 dendrites. So imagine a cell with 100,000 extensions coming off from it. it is a very important cell that is receiving information from many, many, many other cells. And then the Anaxonic neurons, I'm not going to talk about them anymore this semester. It suggests again that there's no axon, but as the text tells you, that's not really accurate. They just have a smaller axon than most. Now, what do axons do? Well, axons talk to each other, right? They talk to each other. Axons also directly speak to muscle, and they also directly speak to glands. But let's take a look at here two neurons, one talking to another. When we're in this scenario, we'll talk about a presynaptic cell and a postsynaptic cell. They're both neurons, right? They're both neurons. Here's our classic neuron, and here the signal is traveling down from the soma, down the axon. Notice the artist did not put the Schwann cells on here, but they would be here. Goes on down. Here are those telodendria. It synapses with another neuron. That neuron is post-synapse, so it's referred to as the postsynaptic cell. We'll come back and look at that pre- and postsynaptic later on. When you are looking at neurons, they are really quite easy to identify. So I think when you see this again in lab, under the microscope, you will have no difficulty at all identifying a neuron. Now there's a few other specialized neurons that I've crossed off here. So remember, if it's in blue, we're not going to worry about it. So there are different classifications, different types of neurons. They get fancier, but we're not going to cover any of these. So don't worry about the content in blue, nor figure 12.13. So that's a neuron. Neurons are excitable. Neurons are the electrical zinging cells in your nervous system. Neurons are found both in the CNS and the PNS. Now the other cells of the nervous tissue are the glial or the neuroglial cells, and these are the glue cells that are going to hold everything together. Now it turns out that there are 6 types of glial cells, and yes, you're responsible for all 6. The rest of this section, I'm going to be describing what each of these 6 cells is doing. Okay, so 4 of these cells are found only in the CNS. That's going to include the ependymal cells, the oligodendrocytes, the microglia, and the astrocytes. Then 2 of these neuroglia are found only in the peripheral nervous system, and these are the satellite cells and the Schwann cells. Now the Schwann cells I've mentioned briefly. These are the cells that are found along the axon, but now you're learning that the Schwann cells are only in the PNS. So let's go through these 6 different cells. Number 1, astrocyte. As this name sounds, astro, star, right? Sounds like astros, astronaut or astrocyte. This is a star-shaped cell. They have many processes, but these are not dendrites or axons, but they are cell extensions, but they kind of look like dendrites and axons. Here's the number 1 deal with these cells. Astrocytes help to create and contribute to the blood-brain barrier. So what in the world is the blood-brain barrier? It turns out that your brain is so important to your overall existence and your longevity that there is extra protection that screens which molecules traveling through the blood are able to leave the blood and get into the brain tissue, the nervous tissue. So these astrocytes serve as an extra level of protection. They're protecting, they are a barrier between the blood and the brain. Very important. And if this blood-brain barrier breaks down, then the brain is not as protected. Now, this blood-brain barrier, though, also creates a nuisance, if you will, because pharmaceutical companies, if they're worried about treating a brain tumor or something like some sort of mental disorder or brain chemical imbalance, they need to make sure that the chemicals that they design are able to cross over the blood-brain barrier. So the blood-brain barrier is actually a problem for pharmaceutical companies trying to create brain-specific medications. So that is the astrocyte right here. I'm circling it. We'll look at the other ones in a moment, but it's sort of this large star-shaped looking cell. Secondly, there are oligodendrocytes. Oligo means a few. Dendro, you know, means tree or branches. And cyte means cell. So oligodendrocyte, a cell with a few branches. And these are the cells that make myelin in the CNS. Okay, so these are the cells that make myelin in the CNS. Let me circle it here. These are the cells that insulate axons in the CNS by making myelin. So what we see here, you'll watch this video, but you see the myelin, okay, and it's being produced and it's traveling only along the axon. The difference is, though, whereby, and you'll see this in a picture in a moment. Let me go back up. Whereby Schwann cells, let's go back to Schwann cells. Let me go back up here. When you see Schwann cells are a single cell that wraps its entire little body and life around a portion of the axon. So this, therefore, because this has Schwann cells, and it says that these are Schwann cells, I know that this is a neuron in the peripheral nervous system. Right? This is a multipolar neuron, many dendrites, in the PNS because it has Schwann cells. When it comes to oligodendrocytes, let's look here. This is an oligodendrocyte. And notice that it's reaching out with a few arms, a few tree-like branches, and it's myelinating. The nucleus for the oligodendrocyte is out here, and it's reaching and myelinating just a section of the axon. Now this axon must be in the CNS. So this axon is in the brain or in the spinal cord. These cells do not coexist. Oligodendrocytes make myelin only in the CNS. Schwann cells make myelin only in the PNS. That's all I'm going to say about those cells. They are the myelin-producing cells, shown here in yellow. Again, note, one big cell reaches out, and notice how one cell can reach out and myelinate multiple axons, right? That's very different than the anatomy seen with Schwann cells. The third glial cell, also found only in the CNS, are microglia. As the name suggests, these are very small. These are the smallest of the glial cells. Their job, they are little macrophages. These are cells that run around. They can move around within the brain, and they are there to ingest and break down pathogens, right? So if a virus or a bacterium were to make it into your brain tissue, these microglia would come along and phagocytose that and destroy it. Okay. So microglia are basically cells of the CNS, and they are macrophages. If we look at the picture up here, right, these little tiny bluish green guys, these are the microglia, much smaller than the other glial cells. The fourth and final glial cell of the CNS are the ependymal cells. Their job is to make, right, let's make this highlighted, you'll hear me say ependymal or ependymal. You'll hear different people say them different ways. So ependymal or ependymal. But these cells are making CSF, cerebrospinal fluid. This is the fluid that is circulating throughout your CNS. You're going to see that it is circulating around your brain. It's circulating around your spinal cord. There are even regions within your brain and regions in the center of your spinal cord that are full of this fluid. This fluid is insulating. It's protective. It also helps to provide nutrients to parts of the central nervous system. The parts of the brain that are full of CSF are called the ventricles. There are 4 ventricles in your brain, and you'll learn and label those in lab. And these ependymal cells line the ventricles. They line the places where, in fact, you find CSF. Okay, so that is your 4th of your glial cells in the CNS. Now, the 2 glial cells in the PNS, 1 satellite cell. And as the name suggests, it's out there in space, right? Kind of out there around, think of our satellites around the Earth. So satellite cells are found around the cell bodies of sensory neurons. And I'll show this to you as we go later. But you're going to see that satellite cells provide protection. They surround and provide protection. Then the other one is going to be the Schwann cells. We've seen this already. And the Schwann cells, remember, are the cells that insulate and create the myelin for axons within the PNS. So the Schwann cells are only in the PNS. Here is a cartoon representation of a satellite cell. So here is a unipolar cell body. Unipolar cell body, right? That one process coming off the cell body. And then here we see Schwann cells. So this is axon. So we have axon. We have Schwann cells. This is definitely in the PNS because I'm seeing Schwann cells. And this is a sensory. Remember I told you that the unipolar neurons are sensory. So this is a sensory neuron cell body. And these 3 cells shown here are the satellite cells that are around the periphery, around the outside edge of that cell body. So this goes through the 6 different glial cells. You add to that neurons, right? And now you have 7 different cells to keep track of in nervous tissue. And then we'll finish up this chapter talking about myelin. Already introduced it. Myelin is produced by oligodendrocytes if we're in the CNS, produced by the Schwann cells if we're in the PNS. Myelin is a lipid-rich protein that is going to surround the axons and only the axons to produce what's called the myelin sheath, this layers and layers and layers of myelin. And this myelin, again, is going to facilitate, speed up the transmission of electrical signals as they travel along the axon. So that's what's going on here. This is sort of like electrical tape going around the cell that is sending out those signals. So we're seeing here in the video, it describes the Schwann cell and how it creates these layer after layer after layer of myelin around the axon. Pretty cool story. Here is a cartoon representation. The video shows it even better. And you see here is the axon. And here is the Schwann cell. It has its own nucleus. It spins around and creates layer after layer after layer of the myelin. The nucleus is shoved to the outside edge. And here is the axon. And the other name for the axon, remember, is a nerve fiber. So here's the fiber or the axon. We know if we're seeing Schwann cells that this is an axon of a peripheral nervous system neuron. You probably have heard a couple of diseases, but maybe didn't know what was going on. Multiple sclerosis, MS, is a relatively common disease. MS is a disease also known as a demyelinating disease. What's going on? In MS, the oligodendrocytes in the central nervous system are destroyed. As a result, the oligodendrocytes no longer can make the myelin. Okay, this is an autoimmune disease. So this is for reasons we don't understand, but the body is actually attacking these cells. Because there's no myelin, the axons of the CNS are laid bare. And think of it sort of like As the electrical signal tries to travel down the axon, because the myelin isn't there the way it should be, the signal is more difficult. It's like little roadblocks. It's like going through uh, construction zones along the highway. So the road's not smooth, and as a result, the electrical signal doesn't go very smoothly down the axons. And this leads to the deficits and the problems that people with MS have. So as the disease progresses, right, they start having issues with motor movement, right? Their movement becomes a little bit less smooth, becomes a little bit jerky. At some point, most people with MS find themselves using a walker, and then maybe even as the disease progresses into a wheelchair. They start having issues with swallowing. They start having issues with vision. All of the things that your brain controls can be affected by MS, okay, and by the lack of the myelin. And then the other name, sclerosis, sclero means hard. So the nerve tissue becomes scarred up, becomes hard, and that also contributes to the problems with conduction of the electrical signals. So read through MS. I think this is an important story for you to know. There's another sister disease to MS called Guillain-Barre disease. Guillain-Barre disease, similarly though, but this disease attacks the Schwann cells. So this is a disease of the peripheral nervous system. It's also autoimmune, but again, only in the periphery. And so the symptoms are slightly different, although there's some similarities between Guillain-Barre and MS. Oftentimes, it is said that Guillain-Barre is a lesser, more slowly evolving disease than MS, but that's not always the case. So that brings us to the end of 12.2. Don't forget, as always, entertain the questions at the end of the chapter, and there's also some labeling activities down here for you as well, not only to learn the names of the glial cells, but their purposes, right? The purpose of the glial cells, as well as some vocabulary checks. Let's move on to 12.3. In section 12.3, which is our last section for this chapter and very short, I basically want to sort of pull together some of the different ideas that I've already described to you. And so here we're looking at functions of the nervous tissue. So let's take a look at the 8 steps that are included here. So this is visually presented, and then these 8 steps are described here, okay, as we go down this chapter. So here are those 8 steps as well. So I'm going to use the picture, and then you can read about it as well here in these 8 steps. So let's start off with number 1. So in this chapter, the story is about feeling warm water, okay, hot water coming from a shower. So as hot water is hitting your skin, number 1, there are sensory nerve endings in your skin. Those nerve endings are stimulated, right, by the temperature. These are thermoreceptors. They're picking up the warm temperature of the water. That signal is going to be picked up by a sensory neuron. And that sensory neuron, in this case, is going to travel from your finger, and it's going to travel up your arm, okay, and it's going to head toward the spinal cord. So the spinal cord is basically the long cylindrical connector between the rest of your body and the brain. That signal is going to travel along that sensory neuron, and look what we see right here, my friend, right here. That, it is pointed out, that is that cell body of the sensory neuron. If we zoom in on this, this is a unipolar cell body. Remember I told you unipolar cell bodies are going to be sensory neurons. If we zoomed in even closer, we would see some satellite cells wrapped around this cell body. So the signal comes into the spinal cord, okay? And now it is going to travel up the spinal cord. So I know this is kind of drawn weirdly, but this is the spinal cord. and you'll get to learn a lot about the spinal cord in the next couple of discussions. And it's going to travel, quote, up the spinal cord, and it's going to synapse. So there is synapsing, right? We see the telodendria of this sensory neuron coming up and now synapsing with another neuron. At this point, we are inside. We're inside, right? We're inside the spinal cord in the brain. So now these are not nerves, but these are tracts, right? This nerve, this was a nerve out here, and once it comes up into the spinal cord, we're going to call this a tract, a bundle of neurons traveling up through here. Here is the synapse, and we're going to synapse on one neuron, synapse on another neuron, and so we have neurons talking to neurons, neurons talking to neurons, and this information is going to travel up into the brain and specifically go to a part of the brain that is involved with conscious perception. So you are conscious of this warm water hitting your finger, and that part of your brain we'll describe later on, but this is the sensory part of your brain. The sensory part of the brain is going to receive this information. It's going to process, consider, think about what to do, right? So if you had really hot water, what would you do? Right? If you had really hot water, you would want to move away from that hot water. So how's that going to happen? So there's another part of your brain up here on the top of the brain called the motor region. We'll come back to that in the next couple of talks. But that is going to send signals down a motor neuron. So the motor neuron is going to come down, okay, and it's going to come down the spinal cord. It's going to come down to the spinal cord. It's going to synapse again, and this signal is going to come out, join up with the spinal nerve, travel to the muscles of your hand, and probably cause you to move away, right? Move away from that hot water. Now, if you wanted to go toward hot water, right, it would send you to the water. So again, it depends on what's going on here. But if the sensation is that you're burning yourself, then you're going to move away from it. If it's cold and you want warm water, then obviously you would move your arm toward that heat or toward that warm water. But that's what's happening here, right? Your body's going to decide what it needs, and it's going to respond to that. I also want you to note something else. This is over here. This is, let's call this the right hand, and notice that the signals are going up the spinal cord and they're crossing over to the left side of the brain. So we'll discuss this quite a bit, but the signals that go to and from the brain are contralateral, right? They're on the opposite side, and we've already seen that word decussate to describe the crossing over of these neuron pathways. So we'll see that again, but again, it's kind of pointing it out here that the left side of the brain is receiving and controlling signals for the right side of the body, and vice versa. So again, this story is described to you here in words. We're going to build on this as we move forward. The 7 or 8 steps are included here. And then it gives you just a little bit more detail, right? It's telling you that the sensations in the fingers are called thermoreceptors. They're receiving that signal. There's a couple of details in here that I'm not going to worry about, but that electrical signal is going to propagate or travel, and eventually wherever there's a synapse, there's going to be the releasing of a neurotransmitter. So this is kind of breaking down the same story into its individual parts. So I'll let you read through this. Basically, though, I have described it to you at the top with the complete picture, but here it is describing to you sort of the breakdown in additional pictures. And that is the end of this section. It's a very, very short section. You can answer this question for sure. So definitely look at these 8 events and put them in order. They're the same events from that top image. That brings us to the end of section 12.3 and the end of the material that you're responsible for chapter 12. And again, don't forget to answer these questions at the end of each section.